Benjamin Netanyahu gave a fiery speech against Yitzhak Rabin and the Oslo Accords. The rally that some point to as inciting the violence that led to Rabin's assassination. In the crowd was a 19-year-old man, an activist, who would go on to become one of Israel's most powerful politicians. His name, Itamar.
Yanked the ornament off the hood of Rabin's car, and there is a television interview of Itamar Ben-Gvir holding this ornament up to the camera and saying, you know, if we can get to Rabin's car, we can also get to Rabin.
That video of Ben-Gvir holding up Rabin's hood ornament thrust him into the public eye. A few weeks later, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a far-right extremist. Itamar Ben-Gvir was born in the suburbs of Jerusalem in 1976, a year before Menachem Begin's political earthquake. Ben-Gvir's parents were Mizrahi Jews with Kurdish and Iraqi ancestry. He grew up in a conservative household that supported both the Likud and Labor parties. His early activism was tied to the settlement movement, a movement that was going through its own internal tensions.
Should the aspiration be where people are going to live in bougie settlements and that satisfy, you know, the requirements of living in the whole of the land of Israel while still having a shopping mall down the street? Or is this a fringe movement that is, you know, engaged in essentially open warfare against a state that isn't doing enough to make Israel into more of a theocratic state?
It was also the moment when tensions between Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories were about to erupt.
Fighting began after 4 workers from the Israeli-occupied Gaza Strip were killed when their car collided with an Israeli army truck.
In December of 1987, the first Intifada, or Palestinian uprising, began.
Palestinian violence seems motivated by despair.
It was not just the buildup of frustration among West Bankers and Gazans at the lack of political progress or the lack of social services.
The first Intifada was fueled by Palestinian frustrations against Israel's occupation and the expansion of settlements. It lasted for almost 6 years. It's when Hamas, the current ruling government in Gaza, was born and was marked by sporadic attacks on Israeli targets. This was also when Itamar Ben-Gvir became radicalized and joined with the Kach party and the Kahanis movement. Itamar Ben-Gvir's views were so extreme so early on that they kept him out of Israel's mandatory military service. He would rack up a ton of arrests. He's been indicted over 50 times and was found guilty of carrying a sign that said, "Expel the Arab enemy." He has been convicted of inciting racism and supporting a terrorist organization. And a lot of this was happening during the second Intifada that began in 2000.
The second Intifada was, you know, a terrible time in Israel where buses were blowing up, you know, on every street corner. You never knew when you got on a bus, is today going to be the day that, you know, you're on your way to work or school or, you know, to visit a friend and a bus is going to blow up?
As the cycle of violence intensified, and after defending himself so many times in court, Ben-Gvir decided to go to law school.
His first part of his career was defending settler terrorists. Then he runs for the Knesset. All this time, you know, he is bringing with him this legacy as a youth activist, deeply involved in Kahanism and radical politics in the settlements.
And he was just always seen as this random fanatic in many respects.
This is Amjad Iraqi again.
But the scene slowly started to evolve that allowed him to not only become legitimate, allow him to be seen as someone who actually has rational thought, as someone whose ideas, political ideas, actually have a rational place in our spectrum.
אני חושב שאם יפנו את יישובים של יהודה, שומרון ועזה, יישפך דם.
This is Ben-Gvir in a 1994 interview saying, "I think if settlements are dismantled in the West Bank and Gaza, blood will spill."
and he ends up at the head of a party called Otman Yodit, which means Jewish Power.
Jewish Power is a far-right party that advocates for deportation of Palestinians. It's a descendant of the Koch party. Ben-Gvir has led the Jewish Power Party since 2019. Until recently, he kept a picture in his living room of Baruch Goldstein, an American-Israeli settler who massacred 29 Palestinians in Hebron in the 90s. Today, everyone also understands that running away brings war, that if we don't want to be there again, we have to return home and rule the territory, and indeed propose a moral, logical, and advantageous solution encouraging emigration and the death penalty for terrorists. There's been increasing violence and an increasing inability to reach any kind of resolution. Has that opened up the door for the message, an extreme message like the one from Kahana or Ben-Gvir or many other right-wing Zionists to find a place in the mainstream discourse?
Yes, definitely. We can really think about it as the post-Oslo generation. After the Oslo Accords, what it essentially did was it hermetically sealed off many, many Palestinians from meeting Israelis just in the course of day-to-day life. And so the only encounters that you really had were between Palestinians in the West Bank and Israeli soldiers or Israeli settlers. What you have is two populations that are kind of sealed off from one another. It's hard to really communicate the extent of just the everyday grinding violence that the occupation demands. And it's everything from extreme levels of surveillance to checkpoints to segregation to structural violence, keeping Palestinians penned in ever smaller areas of land. You have a wholesale internalization of the idea that this kind of violence is not only normal, is not only acceptable, but is actually justifiable and is righteous. You should not feel bad for accepting this kind of violence or instituting this kind of violence, because actually when you do so, you are doing it for love of your people and love of your country. That message is going to resonate.
Coming up, Itamar Ben-Gvir brings Kahanism into the highest levels of government after the Prime Minister comes calling.
This is Margot Vandenhelder from San Francisco, California, and you're listening to Through Line from NPR.
Support for NPR and the following message come from NPR sponsor Allianz Travel Insurance. From quick weekend getaways to international vacations, an annual travel plan from Allianz Travel Insurance can protect your adventures for the next 365 days. And with benefits starting as close as 100 miles from home, you can have peace of mind wherever you go. Get a quote at AllianzTravelInsurance.com.
Part 3. The Rise of Netanyahu.
Do the Palestinians have a right to a separate state?
No, I don't think they do, but I think that it's quite instructive that the Palestinians who are invoking the right of self-determination, which is an attribute for separate nations, themselves are the ones who define themselves as part of the Arab nation.
This is a 28-year-old Benjamin Netanyahu on a TV debate show called The Advocate. It was 1978, and back then he went by the name Ben Nettai.
Mr. Nettai is a graduate of MIT. He is an Israeli, and he is a man who has written widely on this question before the House tonight.
That question was, should the United States support self-determination for Palestinians in a Middle East peace settlement? Here was Netanyahu's answer.
I think the United States should oppose the creation of a Palestinian state for several reasons. The first one being that it is unjust to demand the creation of a 22nd Arab state and a second Palestinian state at the expense of the only Jewish state.
Even in his 20s, Netanyahu emerged as an effective spokesman for conservative Israeli politics in the U.S., including the mention of a second Palestinian state, since many right-wing Israelis argue that Jordan already exists as a Palestinian state. Netanyahu's role as a conservative spokesman may not be a surprise when you consider the world and the family he was born into.
Benjamin Netanyahu had been known to Israeli politics because his father was a key figure in the revisionist Zionist movement. He was not well accepted by Israeli labor government leaders or by Israeli socialist society, and always been sort of on the margins of both an academic career and a political trajectory.
Benjamin Netanyahu was born in Tel Aviv in 1948, just a year after Israel's creation. But when he was a teenager, his family moved to Pennsylvania when his father took a job there as a professor.
He had much of his education in the United States, and that's important because it gave him a particular kind of political approach that has proved very, very successful in Israel. And he also speaks very good English, which is really considered a boon in Israel, and not just for speaking to the outside world, but it's just kind of, there's like a cachet that comes with it.
He returned to Israel after high school to join the military. He eventually became a special forces soldier and saw combat action in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. After the war, he returned to the U.S.
and reinvents himself as kind of a political commentator and, security expert and other guises, I guess.
He served several posts in the U.S. for the Israeli government, including at the Israeli embassy.
They're really fine-tuned the message that he likes to deliver to the outside world about why Israeli politics is the way it is and why Israel has to treat the Palestinians the way that it does, which is that Israel is this kind of last outpost of quote-unquote Western civilization, and that it's, the last line of defense between Europe and the Middle East.
Netanyahu returned to Israel with deep connections in the U.S. and a renewed sense of purpose. He jumped straight into politics, getting involved with the conservative Likud party.
He climbs the ladder in Likud, and he wins the chair of the party in the mid-1990s.
Netanyahu, who was always very savvy to the pulse of the Israeli public, really understands that the 1990s is a moment where Israel is at the brink of a civil war.
אני אומר לה בשם הציבור הגדול הזה, אנחנו כאן כי לעולם לא ניתן לחלק מחדש את ירושלים.
And so when he delivers his rousing speech at that 1995 rally in Jerusalem against Oslo and Yitzhak Rabin, he has his own political ambitions in mind.
This is something that he knows will draw a political base toward him, will help a right-wing political base consolidate around him.
Netanyahu was right. It worked.
And sets about campaigning for prime minister at the elections that follow Rabin's assassination. And by the way, in his campaigns for the prime ministership, he actually enlists the support of American Jewish political advisors who were advising various GOP candidates. So there's this kind of importing of American political tactics into Israel, which are very much about the individual. It's about the personality, and Netanyahu kind of leans into that.
He ran on a platform of economic reform and promised to oppose a Palestinian state. And he was able to tap into the anger against the Oslo Accords to bring out the vote.
He becomes prime minister, despite the role that he played in the incitement campaign as, one of its most high-profile figures.
While a lot of Netanyahu's political success was due to his own shrewd strategy, he also benefited from the failures of the Labour Party-led negotiations with Palestinians. As the promise of Oslo faded away and the Second Intifada loomed, suicide bombings and violence were a regular occurrence on the streets of Israel.
for a lot of Israelis, it almost like disproved the Zionist left thesis.
This is writer Amjad Araki again.
The idea of giving Palestinians more rights, potentially a Palestinian state, the Oslo process in general. The narrative is that you tried to give Palestinians their rights and their state to it, and what we actually got was suicide bombings. That's the logic. And it's not to minimize, I think, the social and political trauma that was experienced by Jewish Israelis during that time, but the answer that was provided to that was to say, like, actually the right-wingers were right.
But Israelis got tired of Netanyahu's hawkish posture, a sluggish economy, and a peace process that had ground to a halt. He was being accused by many on the right of being too centrist. So in 1999, he lost his re-election bid. It was a crushing defeat for Netanyahu.
לכן אני מודיע היום על כוונתי לפרוש מהנהגת הליכוד.
In the time he was out of office and out of the public eye, he seems to have figured something out. If he were going to make a political comeback, he'd need to move further right. And 10 years later,
in Israel, conservative Benjamin Netanyahu was sworn in as prime minister last night. Today, he returns to the office he held a decade ago.
In 2009, he recaptured the prime ministership. And again in 2015, when he was challenged for re-election, he pushed his messaging further to the right.
His surprising and crushing victory, the product of an 11th hour push for right-wing votes, promising there would be no Palestinian state on his watch.
The right regime is in danger. The Arab voters are coming in huge amounts to the polls.
But unlike the US, Israel has a parliamentary system, which means even if your party wins an election, you still have to form alliances with other parties to create a majority in order to be a ruling government. Because of his inflammatory rhetoric, it was going to be hard for Netanyahu to create that government with mainstream parties who were turned off by his strategy.
So he looks towards, parties to his right and decides that, the kind of government that he wants to form is an ultra-nationalist and ultra-Orthodox coalition, because he doesn't want to have a national unity government, and he certainly doesn't want to partner, with leftist parties.
Netanyahu is starting to get into a lot of legal and thus political trouble because he has corruption and bribery charges racking up. And so the country keeps going to elections as Netanyahu sort of tries to outrun these charges and tries to remain in power.
He certainly doesn't want to be in government with anybody who might want to replace him and put him in prison. So these are his options, and he acquiesces to this situation.
Netanyahu, to survive, has courted the most right-wing parties in the country. And one of the people he has cut a deal with is a politician who was also at that anti-Rabin protest back in 1995, Itamar Ben-Gvir.
And in the next election, which was back at the end of 2022, the combined slate that he runs on with another far-right party called Bunch of Zionism pulls in 14 seats. Ben-Gvir gets into the Israeli government, and he basically gets to play kingmaker because of the number of seats that he's pulled. And Netanyahu, he is crucial to Netanyahu's coalition at this point, and so he gets appointed as National Security Minister, which is a new position which puts him in charge of all the police on both sides of the Green Line.
The Green Line refers to the pre-1967 border between Israel and the West Bank.
And nobody's held power over both sets of police in that way before.
And so they're all interconnected. Everyone has thought they had something to gain. And this is what allows what was once a kind of seemingly random, thuggish activist / lawyer to become someone who has an entire ministry designed around him, who is now sitting in major meetings of the government, who is now prodding the prime minister and the defense ministry and the military that you're not going hard enough.
Natasha Roth-Rowland says Ben-Gvir went from a pariah to a popular figure in Israel, especially with young people.
He voices what they see as things that they may not be allowed to say themselves. He voices the id of the nation in a way, in much the same way that Trump did. And
what kind of views was he expressing?
Just unabashed racism toward Palestinians. Understanding every Palestinian essentially as a terrorist. Supporting the death penalty for quote-unquote terrorists, which in this case is simply a dog whistle for Palestinians. Supporting mass expulsion of Palestinians, terrorizing Palestinians who are simply going about their daily lives, basically implementing Kahana's vision any way that they are able to.
Netanyahu has basically been in power since 2009, and with each coalition that he had, he enabled more and more far-right people to come into the Likud, to come into these coalitions, and to be accepted into the political sphere. And Netanyahu definitely helped to facilitate that.
Amjad Iraqi says that over the last 15 years or so of Netanyahu's prime ministership, the longest in the country's history, by the way, his attempts to survive politically haven't just had an impact on the Knesset, but also on Israeli public opinion.
Bibi's tenure was really a lesson for Israelis that actually you don't have to play, that if you kind of just keep pushing the envelope, you'll find that there are actually no consequences. So why wouldn't you just keep going more right-wing? Why wouldn't you keep saying more racist and explicit things? They're so unafraid to say things that 3 decades ago, they would have had to think many times before they could say so.
But Netanyahu and his Likud coalition overplayed their political hand in 2023 when they proposed a law that would eliminate the oversight power of the Israeli Supreme Court.
Israelis woke up today to their 3 largest newspapers carrying a black front page.
The black pages were ads that protesters took out, calling it a dark day for democracy in Israel.
This move to weaken the judiciary was met with intense protests throughout Israel.
Until now, the Supreme Court in Israel has had the right to reject some government actions it did not consider reasonable. So what happens now that the Knesset stripped that power away? People of all ages are protesting in Israel. Doctors and lawyers are among those objecting to the parliament removing a check on its power.
You know, I think if you actually ask the average Israeli on the street, like, what are the 3 major, platforms of the, of the judicial reform plan? Most people weren't necessarily interested in the, technical details of what, was going to happen with basic laws or overrides and all these kinds of things. But they did see this as being my values against your values, secular versus religious, interest in some kind of future negotiation of the Palestinians versus hardline, or even violence towards, Palestinian civilian communities. Do you want peace or do you want Itamar Ben-Gvir? It often, sort of got framed along those terms.
Although Israel's right wing had won the day politically, there were still many Israelis who were deeply uncomfortable with the direction the country was going. Enough to fill the streets with protests. But Natasha Roth-Rowland and Amjad Iraqi argue that there were still many voices missing.
The most telling thing about them was that they were not protests that involved Palestinians. And the reason for that is that what Israelis were protesting against was not the huge, decades upon decades upon decades long oppression of Palestinians, or West Bank or anything like that. They were simply protesting, by and large, against what they saw as the potential curtailment of their own rights as Jews in a Jewish state.
It's not a battle for democracy. It is a battle to maintain at least a little bit more of an image, to try to reclaim a bit more of an image that we're a democracy, that for Jewish Israelis to convince themselves, because they realize that maybe we took it a bit too far. But Palestinian citizens know full on, no matter who was the head of the coalition,
what kind of flagging is that? Don't have enough signs? What the hell?
were in the court, that actually the state always pursued the same objectives against Palestinians.
Sarah Yael Hirschhorn says the divisions on Israel's left and right are fundamental and got to a dangerous point last summer.
It really felt like Israel was on the brink of a kind of civil war, and people were really worried, and it was starting to happen towards the end of the judicial reform process as things were starting to get a little violent. You know, it was becoming increasingly scary because no one really knew, how this was going to play out. October 7th in some ways, just ended this whole debate because Israel, immediately came together because of this tragedy, but also the necessity of the war effort to unify as a country. But some of these divisions are still simmering under the surface.
And that's it for this week's show. I'm Randa Abdel Fattah.
I'm Ramtin Arabzoui, and you've been listening to Throughline from NPR.
This episode was produced by me.
And me, and
Lawrence Wu, Julie Kay, Anya Steinberg, Casey Weiner, Christina Ken,
Devin Katayama,
Peter Balanon Rosen,
Irene Noguchi.
Fact-checking for this episode was done by Kevin Vogel. The episode was mixed by Josh Newell.
Music for this episode was composed by Ramtin and his band Drop Electric, which includes Anya Mizani,
Naveed Marvi, Sho Fujiwara.
Thanks to Johannes Durkee, Kara West, Tony Cadden, James Hyder, Jerome Sokolovsky, Edith Chapin, and Colin Campbell. And finally, if you have an idea or like something you heard on the show, please write us at throughline@npr.org.
Thanks for listening.
And before you go, check out NPR's Embedded podcast. They have a 2-part series out now highlighting NPR's reporting in Israel and Gaza. Jerusalem correspondent Daniel Estrin reflects on getting nuanced, complex voices from multiple sides of this highly volatile story. And Morning Edition host Layla Fadel brings us the voice diaries of a young...
This is Hidden Brain. I'm Shankar Vedant. If I asked you what it means to be a good person, I'm guessing you would quickly rattle off a list of virtues. Good people are truthful. They're kind to others, helpful to those in need. They are loyal friends, generous, brave. They put the needs of others before their own needs. But if I were to ask you where those beliefs come from, or why you think kindness and bravery and generosity are virtues, you might have to pause for a moment to think. Let's say I make it even more complicated. I give you a scenario about 2 brothers who love each other dearly. One does something wrong, and the other has to decide whether to turn him in. The second brother must choose between honesty and loyalty. Which virtue is more important? If you picked one, do you know why you chose it? TV shows and movies are filled with these kinds of moral dilemmas because they provide dramatic tension. When you have to choose between competing values, you might find yourself unsure if kindness matters more than courage, or if loyalty should outweigh honesty. Playwrights and poets have grappled with these themes for centuries because our moral choices define us. They help us distinguish friend from foe. They inform whom we love and whom we hate. Today, we examine the roots of our moral intuitions. We also tell the story of a man who asked himself a question few of us do. Why do I believe what I believe? Understanding the origins of our moral beliefs and the implications of this quest on young minds. This week on Hidden Brain. Support for Hidden Brain comes from Visit Williamsburg. In Williamsburg, Virginia, you're free to live life at your pace. That means whether you're a foodie, a golfer, a history buff, a shopaholic, an outdoor enthusiast, or a thrill seeker, you'll find exactly what you're looking for and more. Plan your visit to Williamsburg today at your pace. Support for Hidden Brain comes from Discover. With 24/7 US-based live customer service from Discover, everyone has the option to talk to a real person anytime, day or night. Yes, you heard that right. You can talk to a human on the Discover customer service team anytime. So the next time you have a question about your credit card, call 1-800-DISCOVER to get the service you deserve. Limitations apply. See terms at discover.com/credit card. Support for Hidden Brain comes from Progressive, where drivers who save by switching save nearly $750 on average. Plus, auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Quote now at progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations. Jonathan Haidt grew up identifying as a Democrat. It wasn't something he thought about a lot. His friends and family all identified with the left.
So that was just the water I was swimming in. I didn't really think much about it. At the time in the 70s, in high school, like that's what was cool, was to be on the left. And I thought Republicans were, stupid and evil, just like everyone around me seemed to think. And then, once the Reagan era began in the 80s, when I was in college, then it was just, absolutely essential that you hate Reagan and everything he stood for.
John and his classmates and professors at Yale University were outraged by Ronald Reagan's cuts in domestic programs, his efforts to roll back environmental regulations, and his support for South Africa's apartheid government.
I was very moralistic, very judgmental. I had strong opinions about what was right and wrong. So, all they seem to care about is tax cuts. They don't care about poor people. It's just that I never actually met a conservative until I was in graduate school. And so it was just kind of obvious that if you care about people, humanity, and the planet, you have to be a Democrat.
But after John finished a PhD in psychology and went to Chicago for a postdoctoral fellowship, 3 life-changing things happened to him. First, he started to work with Richard Schrader, a cultural anthropologist at the University of Chicago. The senior scholar taught John the first commandment of his field. Quick judgments are antithetical to curiosity. When you swiftly pigeonhole people into good guys and bad guys, you never learn anything. Learning to see, to observe without preconceptions, was the essential tool of the social scientist. Outside the classroom, John's leisure activities were teaching him the same thing.
Okay, well, so here I have to turn us onto a track that I've never done before. So this was in June of 1993. I took LSD for the first time with my friends from graduate school. And here I was, a postdoc at Chicago. I'd been interested in Buddhism and Hinduism for a long time. I read the Bhagavad Gita. And then I tried these drugs, first LSD, and then it was so transformative that I then tried psilocybin mushrooms a few times. And the effect that these drugs had on me changed not just my perspective, but my personality. So before June 11th, 1993, I was very judgmental, self-righteous, and when I went on this trip, it was like I was taken out of my world out into a space where I could look down on the world and see not just my world, but an infinite set of worlds just out there, all doing what they're doing, and it all was okay. There's a feeling that this is just the universe playing out the way it needs to. All the beauty, all the ugliness, it's all just part of the universe the way it is. But I recently came across this beautiful passage from the poet Rumi. He says, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. Ideas, language, even the phrase each other doesn't make any sense." And that's exactly what happened to me.
That same year, John went on another trip, a physical trip, to India. He spent a few months in the temple town of Bhubaneswar, about 250 miles from Calcutta, or Kolkata as it is known today.
This is really the turning point of my life, is that year 1993. I was there to study ideas of purity and pollution. I had done graduate work in my PhD on the emotion of disgust as a moral emotion. And in India, throughout South Asia, and really in most of the world, there are very elaborate notions of purity and impurity, or Shuddha and Ashuddha in Sanskrit languages. And you find these ideas in the Hebrew Bible, you find them in ethnographies, they're almost universal ideas. And so I was there to interview people about them and really try to understand, why do people care so much about when you take a bath or what you eat before you pray? So the key thing about moral disgust is that the human mind sees properties in objects that are not material. So, if somebody offered you a sweater that had been worn by Adolf Hitler, but had been completely washed, would you wear it? And most people say no. It has an invisible Hitler essence. It's contaminated. And, a lot of stuff follows this law of contamination, and it's a moral property. Now, that might just seem like a little quirk of morality. But then, as I was reading ethnographies about a variety of societies, well, it turns out the great majority of societies have these very strong beliefs about how biological properties get transmitted and they have spiritual ramifications. So, for example, before you pray, and this is true in Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, you have to prepare yourself. It seems arbitrary. You have to bathe in a certain way, or you have to avoid certain foods. But what I came to see is that it's a way of orienting your life as if you have divinity within you. Most people, most cultures, seem to proceed on the idea that we all have a little bit of divinity or God or something within us, and that obligates us to act in certain ways and not in other ways. So India, more than almost any place else, has very, very clear laws and rules about purity, pollution, bathing, food, illness. The physical and the spiritual are very tightly intertwined in Hinduism.
Bhubaneswar's old town features an enormous, ornately carved stone temple that is more than 1,000 years old. When he was not doing his research, John would wander over to the temple and watch the worshippers.
It really felt like just entering a different world, and I was open to it in a way that I wouldn't have been if I was back in the United States. There's a different rhythm. There's a sense that the land, that everything has a kind of almost like a topography of purity. Like there are certain things that are holy or sort of like up in a sense, and there are other areas that are polluted. And it really felt like, like moving from a two-dimensional world into a three-dimensional world. And I just had to learn to be sensitive to properties that I couldn't see in my older life.
So much of what John saw in Bhubaneswar clashed with Western progressive notions of right and wrong. Notions of purity and pollution attached themselves to different groups, which led to the ostracisms of the Hindu caste system. There was hierarchy, inequality, and sharp gender divisions.
A lot of Americans, young Americans, when they go to India, they're offended by the poverty, they're offended by the hierarchy, they're offended by the sexism. But I was there to sort of pretend to be an anthropologist and really try to understand things. So I would be invited over to many homes for dinner, and the father would greet me and entertain me and talk expansively with me, while his wife would be in the background serving and would rarely say anything. Now, as a young progressive American, that would normally have offended me, but I was trying to understand, and over time, I got to see that a world in which it's not all about individuals, it's actually much more about groups, communities, families, and it's the opposite of egalitarianism, but that doesn't mean it's bad. It was like I could see people living in a network where they couldn't just act based on what they wanted to do. They had to check with lots of people, they had to make sure things were okay. And this fits with one of the main concepts in cultural psychology, which is, do you have an independent sense of self, or do you have an interdependent sense of self? And we Americans have what Hazel Marcus calls a big, thick, padded self. We're like a giant billiard ball, we roll around where we want. But what I saw was people who live in networks. They are enmeshed. They can't just move around as they please. I don't want to idealize this. They're often very frustrated, especially women with their mothers-in-law, all kinds of complicated family relationships. It's not that it's necessarily happy, but it is just a very different way of living, which people are deeply enmeshed and embedded.
So, John, you've said that your experience in India led you to step out of the Matrix. Is that a reference to the movie, The Matrix?
Oh yes, it's exactly the movie The Matrix, based on the novel Neuromancer by William Gibson. And the key line is that the Matrix is a consensual hallucination. Now, as a social scientist, that's pretty damn good. Like, yeah, that's what society is. And that's kind of the miracle of human civilization, how to do this. Together we construct a moral matrix, we live inside of it, we judge people harshly within our matrix and those in other matrices, and we don't know that we're in a matrix.
When John returned to the United States, he found himself consumed with the question that Keanu Reeves' character asks himself in the movie. How do you escape the Matrix? You're listening to Hidden Brain. I'm Shankar Vedant.
Now is the time to embrace a new wave of workers. Every day your team grows younger, more digital, and more drawn to entirely new ways of working, which means you need flexible solutions to connect them where business gets done. T-Mobile for Business was born digital. With America's largest 5G network, we can make it easier to work together from virtually anywhere. Your team may be changing, but with the right tech, it can be more productive than ever before. Get started at T-Mobile.com/now.
Support for Hidden Brain comes from BetterHelp. A lot of us spend our lives wishing we had more time. The question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you use it? Maybe you'd see a movie by yourself, take a nap, read a book, or talk with a friend. Or maybe you'd enjoy doing nothing for once. The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you so that you can make it a priority. And therapy can help you figure that out. BetterHelp offers convenient, affordable online therapy that comes to you. Start the process in minutes and switch therapists anytime. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/hidden today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/hidden. This is Hidden Brain. I'm Shankar Vedant. As a young man, psychologist Jonathan Haidt absorbed the progressive values of his family and schools without question. But when he was nearly 30, John lived for a time in a socially conservative temple town in India. Many of the things he saw there clashed with his notions of right and wrong. But his mentor Richard Schrader had taught him that any system of morality must have helped people coexist. If it failed to do that, it would have gone extinct. So even when he had objections to a moral system, it was worth asking why it came about and how it helped people who subscribed to it.
One thing Schrader taught me is that every society is expert in some parts of human experience and somewhat ignorant in others. And so even though I certainly prefer Western liberal democracies, the sense of anomie or meaninglessness that haunts us in the West is something that really was not much in evidence in a very saturated, religious, thick morality kind of place. Now there are certain practices like dowry which lead to all kinds of terrible distortions in marriage and treating young women terribly. So again, I am not here to defend the Indian social order in general, but it is one of the great ancient civilizations with an extraordinary wisdom tradition. We have to really credit India and this tradition with giving us Buddhism, with giving us these ideas about the veil of Maya, about life is in some way an illusion, and we're better off if we understand that than if we just act as though what we see is reality.
When John returned to the United States, he realized that his certainties about his own secular, progressive moral matrix had disappeared. His feelings of self-righteousness and superiority toward those with different moral frameworks had evaporated. He also noticed that many Americans also had views that overlapped with the moral frameworks he had observed in India. Religious and political conservatives in the United States also placed a high premium on tradition, on order. They too were likely to see ordinary objects imbued with sacred meaning. Why do some people care more about being egalitarian, while others care more about loyalty and tradition? Why do some cultures glorify individual autonomy, while others prioritize the family or the community?
I was already becoming an intuitionist. That is, I was already coming to see that it's really gut feelings and intuitions that drive morality. And so I thought that actually the best metaphor is the tongue, the taste buds. All humans have the same 5 taste receptors: sweet, sour, salt, bitter, and umami, a kind of a meat flavor thing. Yet our cuisines are different. So there's something universal, the 5 taste receptors, but cultures build upon that. They build a cuisine that is different. You can't just build any cuisine, but we don't all like the same cuisine. I thought, wow, this is a great metaphor for morality.
John started to look for the moral equivalent of taste receptors. What were the underlying drivers, the foundations that lay beneath the bewildering array of moral frameworks that you see around the world?
And the most obvious one is that we're mammals, and as mammals, we have babies, and we care for these helpless babies. And so if we see any sign of a cute thing that's suffering, boy, does it get us. We feel like, oh my God, I've got to help this thing. So that hit me as that's a pretty strong moral intuition.
Reducing harm to others and protecting the vulnerable had to be one of the first pillars of any moral system. To be a good person is to care about others.
While I was making up this theory, I was having kids, and to see the way kids react to their stuffed animals and the way they get really upset if you sit on the stuffed animal. Like, wow, that's the care foundation right there. They feel the pain of you sitting on their stuffed animal.
Our sense of fairness is the second moral taste receptor. It's why kids are so quick to holler, that's not fair, if a sibling gets a bigger scoop of ice cream.
There's a lot of research, originally from Robert Trivers, on reciprocal altruism, how we evolved to like to do favors for people, but we keep track of it because then they'll do us a favor in return and we don't want to get ripped off. So we've got all kinds of internal programming about fairness, exchange, cheating, catching cheaters. And it'd be hard to argue that that's not part of our original equipment.
In Western countries, both progressives and conservatives value the moral foundation of caring. They also value fairness, but their cuisines have different flavors when it comes to this aspect of morality.
So fairness is so interesting because every society cares a lot about fairness. But it turns out there are a couple of different kinds of fairness. All around the world, people are sensitive to if somebody or some group is taking more than they're giving. We then get very mad at them. That's unfair, they're exploiting us. Progressives care more about equality, especially equality of outcomes. And they think it's unfair if society ends up with big discrepancies of outcome. Whereas conservatives or free market libertarians would say, look, if somebody starts a business and creates more value, I want him to end up with a lot more than someone who doesn't. So everyone thinks they value fairness, and the other side doesn't. But there are some conflicting notions of fairness.
The other three moral taste receptors that John identified were deeply informed by what he saw in India: loyalty, sanctity, and a respect for authority. John says Americans on the political right tend to value these qualities much more than progressives.
So loyalty is really about are you a good member of your group? And humans evolved to be tribal creatures. We very quickly do us versus them. We love team sports for that reason. And loyalty is we're kind of monitoring each other. Are you really a team player, or are you out for yourself? And here too we find stronger intuitions about loyalty tend to be found on the right than on the left. The next one is authority versus subversion. And that's, do you see the world as having structures that are necessary for society to function, and it is incumbent upon all of us to respect those structures? Or do you say, no, anything about authority is inequality, is oppression. If there are statues, let's pull them off their pedestals. And this is, again, part of our culture war. The right is livid at the way the left seems to attack the American founding fathers and statues. So it's a basic difference over whether authority, tradition, structure are valuable, or are they constraints on individuals? And then there's purity or sanctity, which is again this idea that things have invisible essences that we need to honor. So there used to be a debate in the 90s about flag burning. Should we amend the Constitution to prevent anyone from burning the flag? And on the left, people said it's just a piece of cloth, and if people burn it as an act of expression, political expression, well, that's free speech. But people on the right are more like.
Politics, Mr. Rogers, stuff like that.
You know something, Charlie? You're a pretty smart guy for your age. You know how to handle people. I'm going to see that you get a raise in salary, and you can count on it going through, too.
Gee, that'll be swell, only I don't quite see.
I take, for instance, the night you saw me pick up those boxes of the safe. A lot of guys your age would have told somebody in the office about it, but...
Well, it wasn't any of my business. You're the office manager.
Exactly, but between you and me, it could have been a little embarrassing. You see, I'd forgotten about it. I was supposed to take care of the matter a couple of days earlier, and, well, my ad, and Mr. Rogers, too, they like compliments. You see what I mean?
It's Monday, March 11th. So, Connor, this story begins as a real estate mystery that you took it upon yourself to try to crack wide open. So tell us about where this mystery unfolds.
Okay, so if you imagine you're in San Francisco, and you drive north, further up into the Bay Area, into an area called Solano County. And then you go way east, and you end up in this very rural corner of the Bay Area that not a lot of people know about. And it's over here, in this rural corner of Solano County, where our story takes place. And it's these open, sort of rolling landscape of yellow hills with almost nothing on them. The largest structures there are wind turbines. And a lot of the families out there are farmers. They farm sheep, feed crops, and cows. And many of the people out there have been there since like the 1860s. This is a place where families stay in the same place for generations and pass the farms down several times. This is a place where not a lot changes. But then, in 2017, something very unusual starts to happen. A company called Flannery Associates, which nobody in the area has ever heard of, starts buying land. And they buy more the next year, year after that, more and more and more and more. Until pretty quickly, they're the biggest landowner in the entire county. So all of these neighbors are at supermarkets, they're at church, they're at schools. I mean, this is a place where everyone knows everyone. They're all in community boards together. They all talk to each other all the time. They all sort of simultaneously get these offers for their land.
Right, and like you said, they don't even know who the offer is coming from All they know is that a very aggressive, as we say in New York, highly motivated buyer is in their midst.
Exactly, highly motivated buyers. So they not only want everyone's farm, they start offering people these incredibly sweetheart deals, which say, okay, well, I'm going to buy your land, but you can stay there for the next decade or two, depending on how old they are. And for all that time, you can collect all the income from this land. I don't even want the income of the land. So one thing everyone realizes pretty quickly is these people are not interested in farming. They very obviously have a plan that has nothing to do with farming. And so the question is, what's the plan? And who are these people? Right. So then the county starts to get curious who this is. But because this Flannery Associates is incorporated in Delaware, which has some specific rules that kind of cloak who is behind a company, nobody can figure out who they are. And they send a bunch of letters to the company Flannery Associates lawyer, and this lawyer kind of just puts them off and says, oh, don't worry about it. This is a group of wealthy families who are looking to diversify their assets, and they just want to park it in farmland, basically. Local mayors, concerned citizens are going down to the libraries, pulling property records, and looking up corporate LLCs and stuff to sort of try to figure out who is behind this. The county becomes very concerned about what is happening here. Now, there's an important detail here that I've sort of left out, which is
a mysterious purchase of dry farmland near Travis Air Force Base, one of the most critical military bases in the western U.S., has raised serious questions.
All of this land is near and surrounds Travis Air Force Base, which is a very important strategic Air Force base, sometimes called the gateway to the Pacific. And the concern is that a foreign actor of some kind, spies basically, is buying up a bunch of land around an Air Force base.
Yeah, it may very well be Chinese money.
With a goal of surveilling it or something like that.
For an enemy to be able to be right next to the base, to monitor, to listen into the communications, it would certainly be possible to do that if you own the land adjacent to the fence line of Travis Air Force Base.
There's never any evidence of all this, but by 2023, members of Congress, all sorts of people are flipping out. The Defense Department starts investigating this. The FBI starts investigating this. The State Department starts investigating this. All of these agencies are investigating who is behind this company. You know, just anything you can come up with, people have thrown the idea out, except for what it turns out to be. Then one day, pretty much out of the blue, I get a message. And I can't exactly say where or how or from whom, but someone tells me I know what this is. Tantalizing. This is, at least according to this tip, some of the most powerful people in technology, venture capitalists, executives from Silicon Valley, buying this land, and they're trying to round up other investors to join them. And for various reasons that I can't get into, I sort of knew this had to be worth checking out. So then I started working with my colleague Aaron Griffith, who covers venture capital, and eventually, through a ton of reporting, we were able to confirm that yes, in fact, the money behind Flannery Associates was a who's who of Silicon Valley. Laureen Powell Jobs, the widow of Apple co-founder Steve Jobs. Mark Andreessen, very famous venture capitalist from Andreessen Horowitz.
Right.
Michael Moritz, billionaire venture capitalist from a company called Sequoia Capital. Reid Hoffman, co-founder of LinkedIn. Some of the richest people on Earth are actually the ones buying all this farmland. And the craziest thing is what I learned their plan was. To take all this land, an area about twice the size of San Francisco, on this farmland, building totally from scratch a brand new city that they hoped would help solve California's housing crisis, and beyond that, create an entirely new model for building communities in this country.
We'll be right back.
The Daily is supported by Bayer,
Employee-owned and independent, Baird offers global financial advice focused solely on clients' needs. More information at bairdifference.com. Innovative, immersive, and skillfully investigated. The Daily brings listeners today's stories as only the New York Times can report them. For more on today's episode, go to nytimes.com/thedaily. Distribution of The Daily is made possible by American Public Media. APM produces and distributes programs that entertain and engage audiences everywhere.
Good evening, this is 91.7 WBXU. I'm Mike Eccleston. Coming up on Today Explained, a recent poll shows almost a quarter of registered black voters would vote for Donald Trump. We asked Charlemagne the God, author and radio host of The Breakfast Club, about black voters' dissatisfaction with the Democratic Party. That's coming up on Today Explained at 7:30 here on 91.7 WBXU and 88.5 WMUB.
Support comes from Northern Kentucky University's School of the Arts, presenting the regional premiere of Amelie the Musical, inspired by beloved French film, a whimsical story of Amelie and her acts of kindness that bring both joy and mayhem. March 15th through the 23rd at the Carnegie Theater. Full details and tickets at nku.edu/tickets.
Today's world is more complex than ever, and keeping up with everything that's going on requires trusted sources of news and information. The resources of NPR, the BBC, and the WVXU local news team are available to you every day on air, streaming and on demand at 91.7 WVXU.
This week on Code Switch, how conspiracy theory about eating bugs.
I'm not going to eat the bugs. The bugs are gross.
Spreads by preying on racial anxieties.
Then I like it. Learning to mind your own business.
I'm going to do this for this person and they're going to be happy because it will make their life easier, but deep down that person is thinking, I don't care.
That's on Code Switch and Life Kit.
From NPR.
Saturday mornings at 11 and Monday nights at 10 on 91.7 WBXU.
For years, a mysterious company has been buying farmland on the outskirts of Silicon Valley, eventually putting together a plot twice the size of San Francisco. My colleague, Connor Doherty, figured out who they were and what they were up to.
So what do you end up learning, Connor, about the specific plan that all these rich folks have for this model city that they want to build on this farmland?
So this whole thing, I learned, is the plan of a guy named Jan Sremek.
And who's that?
Jan Sremek is an interesting guy. He's originally from the Czech Republic, and in his telling, he grew up in this tiny town of 1,000 people, but he's this very precocious, entrepreneurial young guy. According to him, he brought internet to his town and actually cut a side deal for himself to get money for this. Is always looking for an angle, and with the help of different scholarships, he studied at Cambridge, goes to the London School of Economics, and becomes a star trader at Goldman Sachs. He leaves Goldman Sachs and eventually makes his way to California, where he does several startups that have a pretty mixed record of success. And one thing to know about Jan is that he's really enamored with the culture of Silicon Valley. He loves the startup thing. He loves the feeling of the way people in Silicon Valley try to blend this kind of philanthropic message with capitalism, and we're saving the world and we're going to make a bundle doing it. But there's one thing he really doesn't like, especially being a European. He hates the place.
He likes the culture, but he hates the physical place.
Hates the physical place. There are, of course, some very beautiful, wealthy neighborhoods, but a lot of the housing stock is these kind of cul-de-sac-y, whatever you would sort of stereotype as the kind of American suburb. It just feels like that. And there's a huge housing crisis in California at this time, and there's just a ton of conflict over whether or not the state should build more, how it should build. So he is coming to this all very fresh. You know, the idea that there's this place where people start big companies and investors give young guys millions of dollars to chase their crazy idea. I mean, this just seems like paradise to him. and allowing more people to move here, building tons more housing, building great buildings, that's what he thinks should be happening. Now, that feeling that Jan's expressing, that Silicon Valley and San Francisco can do better, that it's become too hard to build in California, that this vibrant place has gotten stuck, that feeling is shared by a lot of very rich and powerful people, in particular in the venture capital and tech community. There is this very deep frustration in that world that as much influence as they've had on the digital world, they've had very little influence on the physical world. I mean, these are people who grew up dreaming of flying cars and, monorails through